Okay, so that I just want to be sure I'm understanding, because I've had a lot of residents that are interested in pursuing this. I also wanted to ask the permeable pavers. You're only recommending those for if it's a rear yard, to complete a rear yard as far as landscaping. Is that correct?
Just for clarification, to the chair, the permeable pavers would be permitted only for the purposes of parking, and
Okay.
also for the maneuvering, like the
Okay, got
driveway.
it.
Also, I want to provide the earlier question about the detached garage. If the space is for the required parking, they would have to um, provide the parking elsewhere on the same lot too.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I'm just making a note, spots to be replaced. Got it. Okay, and so that's that side. Now, so I have a situation in my ward where I have a resident who's applied for rezoning of a secondary unit he's created on his property, standalone garage converted to a residential. By applying for that, does that, because he did all of this before we were looking at the secondary units as of right, he cannot sell that. So when you create secondary units on your property, you can't end up now selling that piece. Is that correct? You would not meet the severance requirements.
That is correct. So it is a reminder to everyone that a detached SDU is accessory to the principal dwelling, whether it be a single or a semi or a row townhouse, and it cannot be severed.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad I asked that, because I think it's important to get that out there. And I think lastly, Mr. Chairman, and through you to Tim, you've done an excellent job. You mentioned that you're going to be providing us with the specific maps regarding the RSAs, which is, I'm not sure what that stands for, but the SDUs that are not allowed. And I see you had Lower Stony Creek in that. So will that be sent out later on, so I have an idea of where that's going to be?
Through to the chair, that is correct. I can provide you with that information.
Okay.
That is actually in the existing special figures and in Hamilton zoning bylaw 05200, referring to Lower Stony Creek. But I can provide you with that information offline.
Just so if I need to send it. And what does RSA stand for? I'm sorry. So many
my
acronyms,
apologies.
so little time.
Rural settlement areas.
Got it. Okay. I don't think I have many of those in my ward. Okay, that's terrific. And one last, because I think it was just dawned on me as you were saying that. Oh, you mentioned about, say, as Councillor Farr mentioned, he has a property, and you showed it, Bruce Street, that backs onto Hess. I have a similar situation. Now, you mentioned something that threw me off. You mentioned that in more up-to-date current areas, and that would be the one that I'm referring to, there would be a 1 foot reserve that the city or the developer would have had to take in when they severed off property to create a stub end of a development, but the homeowner maintained the back piece of the property that he fronts with his home on one street, and he has the back piece that's on the second street. So would they be allowed a secondary unit as of right, as opposed to a severance for a building lot?
Through to the chair, as I mentioned, it's in that scenario, it's typically in a newer subdivision where we may ask for a 1 foot reserved as part of the subdivision condition. And in that situation, there wouldn't be any confusion as to which lot line would be considered as the front or the rear.
Okay.
And in that case, you could put a homeowner could put a detached garage, a detached SDU in the backyard in that situation.
Got it.
And again, wouldn't be like severable because of that 1 foot reserve.
Okay. I see. So the 1 foot reserve would now be used as a marker to say they can't sever it if it's a secondary dwelling unit. But if they decide to sever the lot, then they go back to the original process, right?
Well, yes, in that sense, and as I mentioned, with a detached S2, in no way can severances actually occur at all, and staff would not support such an application.
Got it. Super. You've answered all my questions. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The next speaker is Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you, Tim, very much, and to Joanne. I'm really impressed with those revised, those changes. Just in terms of process, I think I have an issue that's similar to the Bruce Hess, and so can I just forward that information to your attention and you can review it, and it would maybe make its way back before we come to council? Can you just confirm that?
To the chair, yes, that is, what we can do is we can take that discussion offline, and that's a very good point that you've made. So we can certainly take that offline, and then we can prepare something in advance for council, and we can also send it to you to ensure that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is just back to the original 50, where are my notes? The 50 to the 75 square meters, which is, you say, equivalent to 2 beds plus a closet space. Could you remind me of the other urban municipalities that are putting in place SDU bylaws? What was the range, and where would that place us? The recommended 75, mid, high, about the same?
Through to the chair, just my understanding that there's certain municipalities in like say Toronto or another like Vancouver and Edmonton that does permit detached SDUs, and they would be in excess of 100 square meters. However, we also have to remember that of the context within Hamilton, lots may be quite small, and so therefore may not necessarily be able to fit in 100 square meter detached SDU. And also, again, the purpose of the 75 square meters is to ensure, yes, design flexibility, but also to address any potential impacts on shadowing, privacy, and so on. Because staff will be monitoring the regulations and any minor variance applications that do come in. So if there is any situation where there's a number of variances, then we could further look into it.
So thank you, through you, Chair. So you'll be looking for patterns then. And if you're finding an excess of variance requests, then you know maybe it may not be meeting our needs, if you will.
Through to the chair, correct.
Okay. Thank you again. Those are my questions for now, and I will forward you that location, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Next is Councillor Collins.
Mr. Chair, I don't have any questions, but I do have comments to make. Is now the appropriate time, or would you prefer me to wait?
Why don't we wait till we get to the report, because we still have delegates and received the submissions.
Let's do that. If you can put me on the list for comments, then I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you. Okay, so we have Councillors Vanderbeek and Jackson as visiting members, and then Councillor Farr for a second time. And then I'm just going to put myself on the list now. Oh, Councillor Ferguson, you wish to speak to this? Go ahead.
Yes, I do. So I fully support these. I find that in my community, there's a lot of families that are uncomfortable now with putting their parents into nursing homes or retirement homes. So they want to put a SDU on their home. And so I'm looking through the Ancaster provision, and I like that they're retaining the 50% of the lot coverage and the 2 cars, minimum parking for 2 cars plus 1 for the SDU. That's all good. The only thing I'm questioning is this is going to be a very appealing and attractive into my, now I'm just pulling a blank on what it's called, the zoning, I got my 2 grandchildren here with me right now too, and they're getting my attention. Joanne, help me. What's it called? Existing residential, the ER zones, because they're large lots, and so I'm curious why in the ER zone you have 1.2 meters setback in for the secondary SDU, but that area has a minimum of 1.5 meter. Why did you change it from 1.5 to 1.2 side yard setback?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Ferguson's question. Why? Is because we're trying to maintain we're trying to maintain consistency amongst all the bylaws. And we didn't see it as a huge amount. When we're talking about the ER zone, that setback had to do, I believe it was the accessory structure. I think that's what we had it for in the ER zone.
It says here a minimum 1.2 meter side yard setback for the SDU. And
that's right. And so I'm unclear about.
Okay. Well, what worries me, Joanne, is if there's an area where developers are going to walk in and try to buy up homes, it's going to be in my existing residential area. And so they're going to buy up a bunch of these, put on an SDU, and then sell it for a huge profit. And it takes, if I get a bunch of them coming, it takes another character with all the neighboring homes that have 1.5 meter setback. Can you see any reason why on the, I think it's called Appendix B, just got to get to the top of it. Yeah, Appendix B, I can't amend the side yard setback in the Ancaster bylaw to 1.5?
Through you, Mr. Chair, you are welcome to do that, or Appendix B, that's the Ancaster bylaw. I was just checking the ER zone to make sure that that's the side yard reference is related to accessory structures, but yes, you can absolutely do that. It is 1.5
meters. Yes, 1.5 meter minimum side yard setback, but it gets larger as the lot gets bigger. But I can live with 1.5 overall. So at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just amend the side yard setback for the SDUs under Appendix P to 1.5 meters, and I'll make that amendment when you start taking motions. Would that be appropriate?
Yes, Councillor. Hang on a sec. Yeah, so we do have 6 recommended staff amendments, and then we can add that as well as a specific.
Perfect. Apart from that, I've read through it. I've talked to Steve about it, and I'm comfortable with it. I think there's a need for these in my community. I just want to do my best to try to maintain the character of the existing homes in the area where this is going to be appealing. So I'll make that amendment at the appropriate time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay, so then I'm just going to put myself on the speakers list. So Councillor Johnson, if you could take the chair.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Collins, did you have a question?
Nope, no question.
Okay. So I'm just going to toggle over to my email, and I do appreciate the presentation from Tim. A number of my questions were asked or answered, but I'd just like to delve in a little bit deeper into a couple of the issues that I see with the secondary suites as proposed. So the first one, again, is just starting from the premise that Bill 108 requires us as a municipality to have a secondary suites bylaw that's citywide. And one of the questions is under Bill 108, are we mandated to have to permit 2 secondary units per property? So in the sense that a property owner can apply for a secondary unit in their principal building, so in a basement or in an upper level, something like that. And then on top of that, get a secondary dwelling unit in an exterior building. So the answer that I saw from staff is that we cannot limit property owners to 1 SDU per property, that they, by Bill 108, were required to permit them 2.
And that's directed to?
To Timothy.
Timothy?
Through you to the chair, that is correct. However, one particular clarification is that even though a homeowner may be able to put 2 SDUs, in this case, 1 internal and 1 detached, there are regulations that are in place that at the end of the day may make it difficult to put 2 SDUs on a single property. So for example, parking might be one of them. It could be the lot configuration, which means the lot depth or the lot width might not be there to permit a detached SDU. So the discussion, I mean, I guess the question, it's not a matter of if municipalities should. It's more of a discussion of what regulations that has to be introduced in order to ensure compatibility, overall compatibility within the neighborhood, and also, in this case, like parking to meet certain requirements.
Thank you. And
Thank you, Councillor.
just to add on to that, so I would much prefer if we could only limit it one per property. So you get either an SDU in your basement or you get an SDU in your exterior building. You could pick one or the other, but you don't get both. But my understanding is that's beyond our jurisdiction. And the concern that I have with the controls that we have in place, as Timothy mentioned, parking and configurations such as offsets and such, is that those things can be overturned at the committee of adjustment. And they're basically, you just go to committee of adjustment instead of, having to have 2 parking spots, they just waive it. And then all of a sudden you've got, 2 suites on a property that really can't support that kind of configuration. So, understanding that there are controls in the bylaw, but my concern is that those controls will basically just get routinely overturned at the committee of adjustment. Another one of the questions and the issues was the issue of rental licensing. So right now in Ward 8, we do have a secondary suites bylaw that is in place along with Ward 1 and portions of Ward 14. It really hasn't been an issue, but the rental licensing bylaw is coming in the next few months. And I really need assurance that all of these new secondary suites that we're going to be creating are going to be captured under that rental licensing bylaw. Now, understanding that initially it's a pilot in wards 1 and 8, but you've got the realtors associations, you've got all of these groups that are pushing landlords and property owners, absentee landlords are pushing as hard as they can for the secondary suites bylaw, for very good reason, because they're going to make a lot of money out of it. And they're the same groups that have been opposing rental licensing for years. So my question through you, Madam Chair, to staff is, how does rental licensing stack on top of the zoning for the secondary suites bylaw?
Timothy?
So through you, Mr. Chair, maybe it's Jason Thorne here. If it's okay, I can begin the answer to the question. Then we do have staff here from licensing and bylaw that can provide some more detail. So the councillor is correct. We have been directed to look at a rental housing licensing bylaw, and we are looking to bring that forward this summer. There's been a number of consultations that have happened around that over the past, I guess, probably year or two now. And to the councillor's question about the scope of that, it is scoped to smaller units. I think it was 5 or fewer units was the scope of the rental housing licensing bylaw. So it would be when that is in front of council in the summer, that would be an opportunity for council to include smaller rental units within it. To the council's question about can we ensure that it will be included, I obviously can't say that because that will be up to council at the time you're considering that report. But that is what we'll be bringing forward, including what staff's recommendation would be. In terms of its linkage to zoning, they are not necessarily linked. You can have zoning without licensing. You can have licensing without zoning. The one way in which they are linked is one of the concerns when we first spoke about licensing bylaw back a couple of years ago. One of the concerns was that in order to become licensed, you would have to have your unit be legal. And in order for unit to be legal, if the zoning didn't permit it, then each and every one of those property owners would be going through what at the time was a full rezoning initiative at a fairly great expense to get their unit legalized so that it could be licensed. So in that respect, there's some linkage, but in terms of whether or not the zoning permissions would require licensing or whether the licensing permissions would require zoning, they don't necessarily have to be linked in that way.
Thank you. And so just so I'm clear, in terms of the zoning bylaw for secondary dwelling units, we cannot make licensing a condition on approval of zoning. that the licensing gets stacked on top. And I think the example that you used, General Manager Thorne, was an area that's licensed for, or sorry, zoned for retail is then licensed for a particular use that's stacked on top. So
yes, so
I'd love to be able to make licensing a condition on zoning approval, but it's my understanding that's not possible.
Thank you,
so
Mr.
through you,
Thorne.
Mr. Chair, in Ontario, we're not permitted to do conditional zoning, where you make your zoning permission conditional upon other things. Yes, the example the councillor gave in terms of you can't make your zoning for a retail conditional upon the licensing of the retail. That's not something that is permitted under the Planning Act to do what planners call conditional zoning.
Thank
Councillor?
you. And then I do have a couple questions and comments on the number of bedrooms per unit, but I'll leave that until I put that motion on the floor. So
oh, good, because I don't have my timer here.
I'm sure I'm over, so I'll take the chair back, and then
I'm sure you were. Thank you.
We'll go to Councillors Vanderbeek and Jackson, and then followed by Councillor Farr for a second time. Councillor Vanderbeek?
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
You're very faint.
Fix that. Just 1 second. Is that better?
That is better.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Some of my questions have already been answered. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to ask questions today. I'm not on the planning committee, but I'm very interested in this topic. I am very supportive of secondary units, and I think that they are an answer, part of an answer to gentle intensification that is desirable. A question that I have would be through you, Mr. Chair, to Tim, and it goes back to the further clarifications in the draft bylaws slide, Tim. The first item on that slide is add special figure maps to the zoning bylaw 05200 to identify the rural settlement areas of Linden, Greensville, Carlisle, Frilton, and Lower Stony Creek, Niagara Escarpment Protection Land area lands. I am curious about two things. What is the reason for no SDUs in my ward, in Greensville and Frilton?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Vanderbeek, I'll answer the questions on the rural area. With respect to the SDUs in the rural area, when the Rural Hamilton Official Plan Amendment was brought forward in December 2020, there's already a policy in place that says for the 4 RSAs that have water, municipal wells, Greensville, Linden, Carlisle, and Freelton, that they would not be able to have SDUs at this point in time. And the issue had to do with the amount of water. So those 4 RSAs, along with secondary dwelling units detached, would be considered during the second phase. So,
okay, so they are going to, yes, so they're going to be considered these in the second phase. Okay.
Yes, additional work has to be done on the wells, and that's why the capacity of the wells.
Okay, because at least I can only speak to Greensville and Frilton, but not everybody's on the well.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. So then the rest of the rural area or smaller rural settlement areas that don't have wells can have accessory dwelling units only at this time.
Okay, thank you. And so I have a further question. So through you, Mr. Chair, it probably is to Joanne as well. It refers to the Niagara Escarpment Protection Area lands. Is that strictly for Stony Creek, or is that for all of them because the Niagara Escarpment Plan doesn't allow SDUs?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Vanderbeek, Lower Stony Creek is somewhat of a unique situation. Back in the days, it does not have development control. It's under the city's zoning. So it has to be cross-referenced as not permitting secondary dwelling units, as you're right, because the Niagara Escarpment Plan does not. So the rest of the city that's under development control, our zoning is only there for information purposes only.
Right. Okay, and so it's not saying, I mean, parts of Greensville are under the plan. I'm not sure about Frilton, but the Niagara Escarpment Protection Area lands reference in this bullet on this slide refers only to Stony Creek or not?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the only one that's actually in the zoning bylaw as it pertains to the city's responsibility is only Lower Stony Creek. It's a very unique situation. Everything else in the Niagara Escarpment Plan in protection, rural, et cetera, is under development control, of which they have 100% control. So it's just a unique situation, which there's a history to that back in the 1970s. I mean, Steve knows that really well. If you want more explanation about what happened in Stony Creek, but it's definitely unique compared to the rest of the city.
I'll take it offline, but I am encouraged to know that this will be looked at again when we do the rural detached. Thank you. That's my questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor. I have Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me join your planning committee as a non-voting member. And I've got 4 basic questions. Forgive me if I was part of your meeting for a short time 2 weeks ago. I could see you folks were going to go almost 11 hours and possibly lose quorum. So forgive me, I didn't stay at all for the whole meeting to hear the entire presentation or hear all the questions from colleagues on planning. And so if my 4 questions seem redundant to anybody, forgive me, but on behalf of my constituents that I know are listening in today, I need to ask them, and they shouldn't come as any surprise to Senior Planner Lee, who I've had a number of conversations with, and Manager Hickey Evans, because during the public consultation period of late last year, I will probably guess that my ward probably submitted the greatest number of concerns and opposition to SDUs, probably about 4 or 5 dozen families overall, given what we've experienced. So I set the preamble and context to my 4 questions, Mr. Chairman, through you to Senior Planner Lee or Manager Hickey Evans. Okay, speaking of conditions, before SDUs are allowed, is there a provision that owner occupation be included, Mr. Chairman? Through you, please.
You're muted, Timon.
Has to happen eventually. Through you to the chair, Bill 108 actually states that the additional dwelling units or SDUs, municipalities cannot add owner occupancy requirements in the zoning bylaw.
Okay, thanks, Timothy. That's very unfortunate. Secondly, through you, was there any consideration by planning staff to, if you will, Mr. Chairman, a good neighbor policy provision as well, especially when it came time for property standards and maintenance, Mr. Chairman, through you, considering owner occupation is not allowed?
Through you to the chair, generally, and you're correct, a number of the feedback that we have received is with respect to property standards and parking and so on. Those are matters dealt with through municipal law enforcement. And I don't know if other staff might be able to assist in this situation.
So, Senior Planner Lee, Mr. Chairman, my 3rd question that dovetails right in. When you were presenting this report and doing all the preparatory work, was MLE consulted about a good neighbor policy? Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Senior Planner Lee.
Through to the chair, we have spoken to MLE with respect to the property standards and other matters that they would be enforcing. Our regulations are deal with land use planning matters, such as permitting these detached SDUs, and we've mentioned also in the discussion paper and also in the presentation in the past that detached SDUs or SDUs in general may be occupied by residents of all household types, whether they be renters or this is someone living, family member, or perhaps a senior or a student. So we have spoken to MLE, and we've had those discussions, and any of those matters would be addressed by them through enforcement.
And thanks, Senior Planner Lee. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, before a closing comment, fourth question, was any thought given to allowing SDUs as a ward-specific type of program? And what I'm getting at is that unrelated, we have special enforcements in wards 1 and 8 regarding special situations, abutting institutions. We've done ward-specific matters in the past on different issues over the years. I'm just wondering, because from the feedback I've been reading with all the submissions, it seems to me that the majority of requests are the wards 1, 2, 3, 4 areas of the lower city, not exclusive, but seems to be the majority. Mr. Chairman, through you to Senior Planner Lee for a comment.
To you, to the chair, the whole idea of permitting SDUs citywide is to not have a piecemeal kind of permissions that we have currently. So, for example, in places such as Glanbrook, we wouldn't be able to permit a SDU versus in Hamilton, where SDUs have actually been permitted since the 1990s, for example. So the idea right now is to permit them citywide so that every corner of the municipality would have the same permissions. And I do have to remind everyone that also in the former city of Hamilton, converted dwelling units were actually permitted since the 1990s, and so these permissions have been in place for quite some time. Versus in other areas such as Waterdown, it's not necessarily permitted for newer development.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the sincerity of Senior Planner Lee's comments and responses to me. If I could just, because I can't vote today, and I'll save my long speech for council, wherever this might go today, just my closing comment, Mr. Chairman. Without the conditions, unfortunately, it's in my humble opinion, it's gonna be sadly wide open to potential abuse. I get the noble thing of grandma wanting to live with the family, of the college kid coming home. I think that's marvelous. But without owner occupation, the other conditions of a good neighbor policy, this is so wide open to abuse. Those are my comments, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for allowing me to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And we have a second-line speaker in Councillor Farr, but I'm just going to quickly say that we do have a delegate as well. So Councillor Farr, I'm going to put you on, and then we're going to go through the delegate, and then I'm going to suggest that we take a break. Our clerks and myself need a little bit of a break, and then we can come back for final discussion on the report. So if committee's good with that, we'll proceed on that basis. Councillor Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to get right back to the beginning through you to Joanne, if we were not to approve these Made in Hamilton solutions, bylaws, so forth, ultimately as a council next week, what happens then?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Farr. That's a good question. There's no police per se. The province could direct municipalities to do that without any other regulations. Back in the 1990s, we had for a short time apartments and houses where we were directed to allow accessory dwelling units without minimal regulation. That would be a potential outcome.
Minimal regulation would be the potential outcome. Thank you, potentially. Thank you, Joanne. And I don't know whether it's Joanne or Tim. I wanted to keep this separate and apart from the amendments you've suggested. I think they're sound and non-confrontational. However, this one, and I'm happy to move them at the appropriate time, as I said, you never went with the suggestion by a few about 100 square meters versus 75. Through you to Tim, I think you alluded to, well, we went from 50 to 75, but the reality is Toronto, Edmonton, I think Vancouver are all above 100. Some are hovering around 120 square meters. So can you just help me better understand why we're stuck at 75 while other cities go larger?
Through you to the chair, there's a couple of factors. The first is we want to ensure that there's as minimal impacts on abutting neighbors, such as privacy and also overlook and shadowing and other matters that might abut a neighboring property, and also grading and drainage. So the idea of having 75 square meters at this time is more appropriate. And also, as mentioned in the presentation, 75 square meters does allow for a 2-bedroom unit to be designed and established as well.
Mr. Chairman, Steve Robichaud. I would also suggest that it's the definition between net and gross. In the City of Hamilton's context, we are saying it's 75 square feet of habitable, 75 square meters of habitable space. So if you were building on top of an existing detached garage, the areas where you would park your vehicle or use for mechanical equipment would be excluded from that definition. So very often when people are looking at the number, it's not a straight apples to apples comparison. It becomes whether it's a net versus gross comparison. So the feeling is that 75 square meters of net habitable space, when you consider that a garage can be another 200 plus, double car garage can add 200 square feet. That would get you very close to the 1,000 square feet that somebody would be suggesting in a 100 square meter comparison in another municipality. So from that perspective, we felt that the 75 square meters as a net living space calculation was more than sufficient in order to create quality living space and still allow for the homeowner to provide adequate storage, whether it be for vehicles or just general household storage in the uninhabitable portion of the accessory structure on the property. That was part of the rationale for the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, one piece I appreciate while we have you then, Steve, I appreciate that over the garage example. I'm thinking a lot about separate dwelling units and backyards and thinking about, and maybe not a lot in Ward 2, but a lot of backyards that are fairly large. And then those other communities that go above 100 square meters. And one of the lists of reasons that Tim just gave and reiterated from before, Steve, through you, Chair, was that we wanted to address things like wind and privacy issues and those sorts of planning and site plan approval issues. So why would that be any different if it was 100 square meters? We would still address those things in the same way, the list that Tim has offered today.
Through Madam Chair, or to the council, you are correct. I mean, we went looking at it in terms of the size of the units. What we were also suggesting is part of the rationale for recommending the lower committee of adjustment fee or the clarification on the committee of adjustment fee. There will be some exceptions to the rule where you have extremely large lots in the city. So we were looking more as an average infill context, not trying to look at sort of the polar extremes, whether those be really small lots or really large lots. And in those circumstances where a homeowner has a really large lot and they're able to accommodate a detached STU that exceeds the current bylaw provisions, then they would have an option of going to the committee of adjustment, and the fee was, I think we're looking at about $650 fee. So that fee in itself would not be a barrier to from a cost perspective relative to the overall cost of the unit. The alternative would be to have a sliding scale or some other consideration where you would say, on smaller lots, this would be the maximum GFA, and on lots that exceed a certain square footage or a certain lot area, then you could have a larger SDU permission. But again, the regulation was based on what we consider to be an average or a typical condition within the city of Hamilton, as opposed to looking at those sort of extreme situations where you have really, really large lots. And in those cases, the homeowners may be able to accommodate a larger building without getting into sort of like a percentage or a sliding scale, like a floor space index or something that tied the size of the SDU to the size of the lot. That was part of the thinking as well, trying to have a very simple regulation to explain to the public and to make it for the ease of administration for our colleagues in the building division. Thank you.
I get that, Steve. Simple's good, and it's actually a $600 fee, less $50 for committee of adjustment. The problem is committee of adjustment gets things like neighborhood appellancy potentially, and that's fine, but also at the mercy of a staff recommendation. So if staff wants to stick you, or maybe the people that come after you, say, oh no, it's in the bylaw, 75 square meters, we can't support anything more. Is there nothing we can do to bring some assurance that, reasonably you can get up to 100, even 120 if, all these other things do not need variances? So I'm curious about about that, making it, if it has to go through the COA to get above and beyond the 75 square meters in size. I'm just trying to figure out how the investor or family member that wants to expand on their property and take advantage of this SDU element can be assured that they're not just going to get punted in the future.
Through you, Madam Chairman. The normal process would be to sort of assess what is the impact as opposed to what is the hard number. The Committee of Adjustment doesn't deal sort of whether it's a 50% reduction or because they're focused on the tests or what are the impact and how does that then maintain the general intent and purpose of the zoning bylaw, which is really an assessment of those impacts. If you were looking at trying to almost get into a conditional kind of model, you would have to, I would suggest that you would have to look at something like we did with the downtown secondary plan, where in terms of building heights, where we gave people everything as of right, and then we put it within a holding provision that would suggest that you could increase the height, provided you submit the necessary studies or reports that demonstrate there's no impact as it relates to privacy, overview, shadowing, those other considerations. That would be the mechanism to do it. Or alternatively, you could build into the bylaw sort of a bonus where you said if your lot it's 75 square meters plus you're entitled to additional GFA provided you meet certain requirements, either increased setbacks or an increased lot area that would give an additional up to 25 square meters of floor space for those lots that are greater than, say, 360 square meters, which is what we consider to be a typical 40 by 100 foot C lot in the city of Hamilton. So we could craft a recommendation that will allow us for that increased GFA based on an increased lot size to a maximum of X square meters, if that was the will of the committee and council.
Yeah, if we could do that, but separately, not part of all the other amendments. I'm sure my other colleagues may have other things to say. And can we include in the requirements you just spoke of, perhaps, if we haven't already, we'd make exceptions if the project was 100% barrier free. We know there's a market for that. There's a need for that, particularly if the SDU is getting used by someone aging in place, staying on the property as part of the family. Is that something we can contemplate, or have we already? Steve, last question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Through Mr. Chairman, the zoning bylaw in the 6593, I know in particular where you exceed the minimum requirements of the OBC in terms of for the purposes of calculation gross floor area, though that you're given relief from those provisions. So we could clarify that in the regulations that if you are building a unit that has say your hallway exceeds the minimum requirements to ensure that it is a barrier-free consideration, you are not unduly penalized for trying to improve the quality of the space that's being provided if it's looking to meet a specific need. So if that was the will of committee, we could clarify that through the regulations that for the purposes of calculating the gross floor area, there's no penalty for meeting or exceeding barrier-free requirements in terms of that additional GFA that's required to make sure that it is fully accessible unit. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Between now and the appropriate time, I might get a hold of you, Steve, offline to help me with some wordage there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. So at this time, we're going to have no further speakers on my list. So we're going to receive the staff presentation. Who'd like to move that? Mover and seconder. Moved by Councillor Johnson, seconded by Councillor Partridge. All in favor? Councillor Partridge, are you able to vote? Thank you. Got everybody? Yep, carries, thank you. And then to receive the written submission, need a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor or opposed? And as I said, we've got one, and then we're going to break for late lunch. Thank you, that carries. And for our delegate, we have Jeff Medrios. Jeff, if you're, thank you. I see you there.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Committee. My name is Jeff Medeiros. I reside on Bruce Street, and I've listened to staff's recommendations with respect to amendments to through lots. That's my particular interest. Bit of a unique situation. Through lots, not necessarily an uncommon part of the lower city downtown fabric. So I just want to say that I do support those revisions. I think that's great. In actuality, through lots probably have less of an impact than an interior lot with respect to a detached single dwelling unit. They're compatible. They work with the streetscape. I recognize the fact that planning staff had really had a difficult endeavor to try to make a one size make basically a bylaw to apply citywide. So I applaud planning staff. I want to thank Tim and Joanne for taking my comments into consideration. I really do appreciate it. Just to maybe take it one step further, and one of the councillors did bring this up. What's being proposed is a site-specific, basically, provision for Bruce and Hess Street South, which is great. I do appreciate that. I think the bylaw should take a step further and basically not necessarily have prohibitions for through lots. The challenge with that is that I recognize the fact probably more than half of these proposals are going to have to go through a committee of adjustment application. It's just the reality of it. There's a lot of constraints with properties in the downtown. But unfortunately, with language that speaks to prohibition in the bylaw, it makes it very difficult to get staff support on a variance application. So I always would recommend in this scenario that, try to make the bylaws as less prohibitive as possible. I think, there's some really good reasons as to why they're permitted. There's provincial policy that also supports it. There's policies in the city's official plan that would allow for this sort of built form. And I would suggest or recommend that committee, allows them to basically be on any through lot in the city. That being said, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know it's been a very long day. Thank you very much. Thank you, planning staff. Thank Tim. Thanks, Joanne. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work. I think this is a step in the right direction and really is a long time coming. So thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Jeff. Are there any questions from committee? Seeing any? Thank you. Okay, so I need a mover and a seconder to receive the delegate. Ready? Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Farr. All in favor? And then skip over. Need toggle. There we go. And then one more vote and we'll take a quick break. So the final vote before we get to the report is the public submissions were received and considered by the committee in approving the city initiatives. Need a mover and a seconder. Sorry? Okay. All right. We'll do that vote after we put all the amendments on the table. So at this point, we're going to take a break until what, 1:20? Does that sound good? All right. So motion to break. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Pearson. Seconded by everybody. All in favor? Okay, so reconvene at D. Just let me know when we're ready to resume.
Are you talking?
We're good? Okay, we're live. Okay, so we're going to carry on where we left off with the secondary suites bylaw. So at this point, there was the 6 recommendations from staff, plus Councillor Ferguson's amendment, and then the amendment that I was going to make as well. So, Councillor Johnson, you had an additional one?
Yes, I did. I sent it around to everybody.
Okay.
And that's if this does not go through or it's a top whatever, this is to help it so at least the rural area can have their secondary units within the homestead. Thank you.
Okay, so that's only if this is deferred to a future meeting. Yeah, okay. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go to Councillor Farr to put the staff recommendations, the amended staff recommendations on the table. Councillor Farr?
Yep, I think we spoke to it enough. I believe you will second.
Happy to. Does everybody have those? Is there any discussion on those staff recommendations 1 to 6? I think they're emailed. Maybe we can just put them up on the screen.
The Bruce Street through lot is among these amendments, and I did hear others interested to that, or perhaps amending that amendment. So I'm happy to entertain that and support it as well if there is someone that wanted to do that.
These are the amendments
Councillor
that
Wilson.
are before you. Is there any discussion on these amendments? Councillor Wilson?
Thanks, Chair. Just to Councillor Farr's part or point, beg your pardon. Yeah, I think we may have 1 or 2 candidates similar to Bruce. So I have already forwarded those locations. Staff are going to have a look at them and assess them. And if they qualify, then for council, it'll be included. Thank you for referencing it.
Okay, thank you. So then the amendments as written then, and we can make any further adjustments for council. So I'm going to call the vote on that then if there's no other speakers on these amendments. All in favor or opposed? Thank you. That carries unanimously. And then Councillor Ferguson, your amendment for Ancaster gets an extra place.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so my amendment is on Appendix B. It's on page 5 of 8, item 9.1.4.1, item B, subsection Roman numeral 2 and Roman numeral 3. And my amendment is to change the side yard setback from 1.2 meters to 1.5 meters to be more in keeping with the character of the neighborhoods.
Thank you, Councillor. Your seconder for that? Councillor Partridge, thank you. Is there any discussion on the amendment? Councillor Ferguson? No, not seeing any?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Councillor Wilson?
Yeah, just to be transparent, I can't support the amendment.
Of course
I know
not.
there's...
Go ahead, Councillor Wilson.
There are many neighborhoods, particularly Kirkendale and Westdale, that are very similar to Ancaster, who will be abiding by the 1.2 in the efforts of putting more affordable units on the market. So I don't know what makes I don't know what's particular about Ancaster to warrant the different side yard. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion? No, not seeing any. So all in favor or opposed? Thank you. That carries. And then at this, I will put my proposal on the table. And this to limit the number of bedrooms. I don't have a seconder at this point, so I don't know if there's anybody from the committee that would like the second to put it on the table. No dice? Anybody? Sorry, I should have handed over the chair to you, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. So this is your motion to limit it to 2 bedrooms, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. So it's moved by yourself. Anyone who's here to second it, I'll second it to put it on the table.
Thank you, Councillor. Appreciate
Any
that.
questions or concerns?
If I could just speak to it briefly.
And then I have Councillor Pearson. Sorry, we're going to have to do the chat lines, folks, because I cannot see and I don't have Elsie Kelsey with me. So go ahead, Councillor Danko, you're on.
Thank you. So the motion is that zoning bylaw 6593, that the size of secondary dwelling units, either in the dwelling or the accessory building or both, be limited to a maximum of 2 bedrooms as defined by the building code. And the reason that I'm proposing this is that as it stands now, there's no limit to the number of bedrooms that can be in a secondary dwelling unit. So the only control is, as Timothy mentioned, was the overall maximum size of 75 square meters. But the minimum is only controlled by minimum building code. So in the staff report, there's a table on page 22 that outlines the minimum building code sizes for room sizes. And I think it goes back to Councillor Jackson's point of what is the purpose of secondary dwelling units. And I think for most residents in Ward 8 anyway, when we think about a secondary dwelling unit, we think about an owner-occupied. We think about that it would be for elderly grandparents, that it would be living in, in the basement or in the upper level. Or we think about a young couple that's just starting out that needs a hand up and an affordable place to live. What we are concerned about, and I think I heard this from Councillor Jackson and from others when there are applications for secondary dwelling units, is that there is room for investors and absentee landlords to come in, purchase up properties, divide them up, and maximize the number of bedrooms in their units. And right now, we do have a secondary dwelling unit bylaw in place in Ward 8. It hasn't been a problem. And we wanted a legal pathway for landlords to be able to legalize their units. But we have recently seen at committee a garage in Ward 1 where the applicant applied for 4 bedrooms. And that's the problem I see, is that without having a specific limit on the number of bedrooms, there's a lot of room for abuse by unscrupulous property owners to provide living space that is really not appropriate for the number of people that would be living there. And it's coming to neighborhoods with primarily single-family homes where it's the density that causes all of the problems with property standards and garbage collection and parking. All those other property standards issues are because of overcrowding and having too many people living in too small of a place. So, overall, I am supportive of secondary dwelling units, but not without a hard cap on the number of bedrooms. And just to wrap up, going back to the table on page 22. So if you take the minimum building code sizes for a living room, dining room, and kitchen, and then the master bedroom and 1 bedroom, that gets you to about 41.5 square meters. So with the maximum size of 75 square meters, you can fit 6 bedrooms in that secondary dwelling unit. And I think that would cause just, in a lot of the neighborhoods, especially, in student areas, but also on the South Mountain where you have very large 2,500, 3,000 square foot houses, to have secondary dwelling units with upwards of 6 bedrooms as of right. We're just asking for all kinds of those property standards problems and just accelerating investors' profits, really. So that's my proposal for committee in order to have some sort of control on the number of bedrooms, to get back to that idea of secondary dwelling units as a place for your elderly relative or a young couple, or sort of like an informal transitory space that's very affordable, but not necessarily meant to be permanent, long-term, multiple unit residences. And with that, I just have one question for staff. I'm probably over my time. So I believe other municipalities have done this when they put in their secondary dwelling units, in particular the city of Guelph. So I could maybe just ask Director Robichaud to outline what it was that Guelph did and how that might compare.
The committee and council during the deliberations on secondary dwelling units capped the dwelling units to a maximum of 2 bedrooms. It does not cap if the individuals want to construct an accessory apartment with an additional room, like a den or TV room, in addition to the living room, sort of kitchen room. But for the purposes of their zoning bylaw, they define a secondary dwelling unit as having a maximum of 2 bedrooms. And that was in response to some of the concerns and the issues that the ward councillor was speaking to about essentially creating a lodging house within a house and then just without having quality living space for the tenants. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Danko, I don't have my timer here, so maybe in fairness, I have 2 people that want to speak to this, and then we'll come back to you. Councillor Pearson, then Councillor Farr. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. And so I understand where Councillor Danko's coming from. I just want to be sure that, I can understand doing 2 bedrooms, but just could staff reiterate, because I thought earlier, I know that if it doesn't have a closet, it's not classed as a bedroom. So how do we ensure that the ways of shortcuts or circumventing that regulation would be met? Through you to possibly Steve, I'm not sure.
So who on staff would like to respond to that, please?
Madam Chairman. My understanding is that under the Ontario Building Code, they set out minimum room sizes, whether you have a closet or you do not. So if you have a bedroom without a closet, you are required to make that room a little bit larger, and that's in the sense that you would have a piece of furniture that would become your closet. There is that potential for abuse where somebody would come in and show an SDU that has 2 bedrooms, and then they may have additional rooms that are labeled as computer room, den, study, et cetera, et cetera. And then it becomes at the discretion of the chief building official whether they feel that the person is being correct in terms of what the purpose is on their building permit application, but we generally have to take people at face value. So that would be the potential risk that somebody would come in, they would show an SDU with the multiple other rooms identified, and then a determination would have to be made whether or not that information was being correct or not for the purposes of the building permit submission. Or the other alternative would be that the homeowner would apply to the Committee of Adjustment to allow them to have 3 or 4 bedrooms, should they be in a situation where they've either been charged for being in contravention of the definition of an SDU, or they're seeking to construct an SDU that exceeds the current zoning or the proposed zoning bylaw permissions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that, and I'm okay with it. I fully support Councillor Danko, and certainly don't disagree. I just know that there will be ways people will circumvent this, and that people should be ready to keep an eye out on things as this bylaw moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and I have Councillor Farr, please.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate where the mover's coming from. If it's city-wide, though, I think he probably knows. I fear it might limit our opportunities in some cases. by capping at 2. Maybe kill an opportunity for a larger family that wants to live affordably, as an example, and needs 3 or maybe even 4 bedrooms. And if they're smaller, that's their prerogative. Also, I've said this before, I think seniors co-oping is going to be a thing, and it's something we should be cognizant of as well, where there's communal space, but maybe 3 or 4 seniors living amongst one another, potentially in one of these SDUs. So I'm a little apprehensive. I completely appreciate the Mohawk precinct issue, and I'm wondering if the mover would consider it, even actually through staff to Steve, could it be site specific to the precincts where this is a major issue, McMaster University, Mohawk College?
Thank you. Mr. Robichaud, can it be restricted to certain areas?
Through you, Madam Chairman, to the Speaker, I would think that there may be challenges that it would be sort of discriminatory in terms of developing that zoning that was had additional regulations in certain areas and not being contrary to the spirit and the intent of the provincial regulations, which are essentially to have a sort of a uniform playing standard across the municipality as it relates to SDUs. So I'm not, without having to, doing a deep dive into it, I think it might be difficult to make it neighborhood or ward specific in response to, say, town gown issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Farr.
So again, appreciating the scenario that is being presented by the mover, who can easily see and knows his area well, a circumvention of things by those who want to create, student housing in student ghettos or even student ghettos. But is there not a way around in that if someone wanted to do that, like you said, Steve, through you, Chair, it's essentially a lodge when you get to 5 or 6. Can't we build something in that recognizes that, as opposed to now basically what this is saying, for someone who might want 3 bedrooms, they would have to go to committee of adjustment again, whereas what's being suggested by staff, that wouldn't have an issue. It'd be as of right to have 3 or 4, whatever works within the confines of whatever square footage. So is there no way to hone in on identifying and licensing or recording accordingly a lodge use? It's an obvious lodge use versus having to limit a bedroom caps in the bylaw through you.
Thank you, Mr. Robichaud. I believe that's for you again.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think one of the challenges, 2 issues. One is the collection of the information. If somebody has a 5-bedroom house and they're effectively operating it as a lodging house, it's been the ongoing ability to collect that information based on that rental arrangements and saying that it is not functioning as a rental unit, but it is functioning as a lodging house for the purposes of the zoning bylaw. And then that becomes where the more of the challenge is collecting the evidence and laying a charge for saying that the use is being done in contravention of the zoning bylaw. That's when it's multiple unrelated people residing in a room. And essentially when you start looking at, I think MLE staff can clarify, but when they start looking at if each bedroom has a lock on the door, if there's, if you get a copy of the lease arrangements, or when you actually start talking to the tenants who are residing there in terms of what that arrangement is, that's what makes it a bit more problematic. It's collecting the information to lay the charge and to be successful in the courts. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor
So through you to Steve, why didn't you cap it at 2? Why isn't that a recommendation?
Steve? Sorry.
It's always a fine through you, Madam Chairman. We're trying to provide some flexibility in terms of how these units are going to be regulated. I think one of what as Mr. Lee indicated, or we've indicated earlier, is very often people, when we put in regulations, if they're seen as being a barrier, people get frustrated by it. Either they're repeatedly going to the Committee of Adjustment, or they end up coming up with workarounds to get around that regulation. And we thought that in terms of more dealing with the unit size, we would be deferring to the Ontario Building Code, which sort of sets out the minimum health and safety standards. And then we would be looking more at the physical development of the site as opposed to a number of bedroom cap. That was sort of the approach that we took to have sort of more flexible zoning arrangements from our perspective. Part of also was the desire to increase the supply of affordable housing and also to remove those regulatory barriers to those units that have been created without the benefit of the homeowner getting a building permit, because it is an ongoing concern that we have is that somebody could be a fire or a hazardous situation. So we were looking based on the feedback and the input that we received is coming up with regulations that would remove those barriers so that people could come forward and legalize some of those existing accessory apartments. Thank you.
So, folks, I'm just going to let you know, I don't have my timer on me, so I'm going to really ask for your own policing, if you will. So, Councillor Farr, would this be your last question? I'm just asking.
I'll just wrap it up. I know. I think I very respectfully can't support it just for the reasons I mentioned. I think I don't want to create an issue where, you know, affordability for families and that potential seniors co-oping issue, which I think is going to be more of a reality and more a part of our conversation as the aging population increases. So I do that respectfully, though, but I do really very much appreciate the issues, particularly around our major post-secondary institutions. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Councillor Partridge, Councillor Wilson, and thanks again for everybody. I see Tamara's Tamara's put some times on the side, so I'll try to keep an eye on that, but just to be fair to everybody. Thank you. Councillor Partridge, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chair, and I definitely won't take 5 minutes. I appreciate the intent of what the good councillor is bringing forward, but likewise, I can't support it. You know, we have an affordability issue, and we have some very large families that are having very much difficulty finding 3-bedroom units. You know, we've got blended families coming together with 6 or 7 children. And you know, the other aspect for me is the churches and congregants that sponsor refugees and immigrants coming into our community, of which Hamilton has quite a few. And you know, I just recently, our next door neighbor who goes to a church in the city, they sponsored a family with 6 kids coming over from Syria, and you know, there was difficulty finding the apartment, and they ended up in one of the congregants' houses in Hamilton and having to put lots of mattresses in the basement, temporary, and that's just not good. That's just not right. So I don't think there should be this kind of a limit putting on it. It's, I don't know, we can only police so far, folks. They're going to find ways around it, and it's not going to prevent developers and investors who want to buy up these homes and turn them into multiple apartments. They're going to find a way. They're going to do it. So what I don't want to do is hurt people who have affordability issues. So that's my position. I can't support it, but I do appreciate where the mover's coming from. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Acting Chair. Similarly to the 2 previous speakers, something that staff said within the context of putting more restrictions on was a 2-bedroom cap would restrict larger families and force them into trying to find more expensive living quarters such as townhouses. And I don't think I've been shy about why I'm very enthusiastic about SDUs. I think it is the quickest, easiest way for us to get affordable units onto the market within existing neighborhoods. And it's also in keeping, I think, with our climate mitigation measures. So I think the motion is thoughtful. However, I cannot lend my support to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Councillor Danko if you have any further comments before we go to the vote.
Thank you. Just a last word, I guess, on this. And I do appreciate the thoughtful discussion by committee this afternoon, because it is a very difficult issue. Overall, as I said, I do support secondary suites. We already have this in place in Ward 8. And it was mainly, again, to give landlords a way to legalize a lot of the suites that they already have in place, which is really important so that you don't have people living in dangerous, illegal conditions. I'm also very supportive of the infill component to this and developing more affordable housing. But again, I'm going to go back to the Hemson report for our grids 2. They're projecting, I think it was 5,300 secondary suites within the next 30 years. So it's not a significant infill source. It's not a significant affordable housing component in the housing projections anyway for the city of Hamilton. And again, you know, if we could put in controls to say that they had to be owner occupied, if we could have, you know, that good neighbor requirement that you only get approval if you can show that you're a responsible property owner. If we could limit it to just one secondary dwelling unit per property, or if we could make it contingent on rental licensing, you know, then this wouldn't be as necessary as I think that it is. But unfortunately, how it stands is the only way that I see anyway is a hard cap on the number of bedrooms, which provides us as a municipality a way to, you know, kind of regulate what that vision for what secondary suites are going to be to maintain the character of the neighborhoods where people are applying for these. And you know, in neighborhoods that have been taken over by rental housing, this is like an ongoing issue almost every day. And it's not just the areas around our post-secondary institutions. There are, you know, when an absentee landlord or investor applies for a secondary suite with multiple bedrooms anywhere in the city, it is a major shock to the surrounding neighborhoods. And, you know, just on the financial component to this, I don't think there's any secret of why realtors and investors and property owners are pushing so hard for secondary suites. It's because it allows them to maintain the current price of housing, the inflated price of housing. And again, it comes back to me anyway, of what is the intention that we're looking for secondary dwelling units. And for me, it's so that the owner-occupied person has an ability to make a little bit of extra money and have somebody live on their property and pay a portion of that mortgage. It's not for investors to be able to finance, you know, thousands of dollars towards an investment property, in my mind anyway. And I would much prefer to have this as a hard cap, so that if you did want more bedrooms, and if you did have a site where that works, you just go to C of A, you apply, and you get approval for having additional bedrooms, rather than relying on it just as an as-of-right zoning, which would be my preference. So anyway, you have the motion before you. And again, I do appreciate the thoughtful discussion with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we go to the vote, I've decided to put myself on the list. So Councillor Farr, if you could take the chair, we're just going to keep bouncing around till everybody gets a turn at this.
Go ahead.
I'll be honest with you. I don't see a problem with this motion at all. And I'll tell you why. I think some of the angst that I'm hearing from my counterparts in the city is that they don't want this to turn into student housing. They don't want it to turn into landlord trying to rent out 7 or 8 bedrooms. So I absolutely am behind this and supportive of this motion. So I think just for the, and I'll take the chair back if you don't mind, Councillor Farr. I don't see anybody else on the list. So
you have 4.5 more minutes.
Okay, well, I can just tell you everything that's happening in my life, but you'll all get bored. So can I call the vote, please? It's moved by myself and seconded by, or sorry, moved by Councillor Danko, seconded by myself. And please vote accordingly. And Clerk Kelsey, if you could let me know what the vote is, please, before I turn the chair over.
Yes, it was 5-3.
Thank you very much. The chair is back to you, sir.
So it was 5-3, which way? It passed 5-3. Okay, thank you. Where was I in my agenda here? Okay, so I don't think there are any more revisions. And then Councillor Collins had indicated that he had some final comments, and if any other committee members have some final comments before we go on to the final vote to approve the report. So Councillor Wilson, I see you. Councillor Collins, I'll put you on first.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. My biggest concern, as I've noted in the past, is the lack of a notification process for adjacent residents and the absence of an approval process. And, prospectively permitting 2 additional units per lot creates a whole host of issues for existing residents. Many of them have been highlighted today in our past committee meeting related to privacy, parking, aesthetics, loss of permeable space in the urban area, and other issues as well. There's nothing in the regulation that gives neighborhoods the ability to say we're opposed or we've reached our saturation point, and that for me is important. As noted in the report, there's nothing in the regulation that ensures that these are owner-occupied intensification efforts. This isn't about accommodating grandma or grandpa, as has been referenced. That occurs all over the city today and hasn't been a problem in terms of accommodating those needs. These conversions will be largely investor-driven products, and everyone around the table knows that prospective home buyers are already competing with investors in today's really overheated housing market here in Hamilton. And as of right, secondary dwelling units in the home and in the rear yard will accelerate conversions and make it more make affordable home ownership even more expensive for people and more difficult for young families and couples to purchase a home. I'm already getting calls about rental conversions and the issues we face with absentee landlords, as Councillor Jackson had mentioned in his questions. They're not maintaining the property, and when they become income properties, unfortunately, in many areas of the city, the price goes up, and look no further than the Mohawk and McMaster neighborhoods as evidence of that. We all remember when the Mike Harris government decided to download affordable housing to municipalities in the mid-1990s. And since that time, supply has been an issue. No provincial funding, combined with declining federal investments, in my mind, have created long housing wait lists here in Hamilton, across the province, and across the country. So the funding vacuum has pushed investors really to purchase singles, semis, and towns, and providing a bit of an outlet on the supply side. But there's a domino effect there. And the issues that come with that, as is evidenced from today's very competitive market, is increasing in very high home prices. So the provincial legislation isn't tied to keeping a family member in the home. It's in response to not keeping up with supply of affordable housing. And their second dwelling unit legislation is really the lazy way out of properly dealing with supply and demand issues here in the province. So the vast majority of residents that I've discussed this matter with can't believe the direction that the province is taking. They're not supportive. And if my residents and I don't have a say in how or where these are located, I can't support it. So those are my comments at this point in time, and I'll be voting against it, Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 amending motions I'd like to propose, and the first one is with respect to what was at the time considered a unique situation in Ward 2 on the Bruce and the Hess Street South, and I just, not a reflection of the lack of diligence on staff's part, but I was quickly able to find, just because of my familiarity with the ward, another example that would, I'm quite sure, would be the same. So rather than add them piecemeal like that, staff are recommending wording in such a way that would enable them to incorporate those examples into the bylaw, if I'm understanding their logic. So to that end, I'm sorry, I'm just quickly reading the email. That staff be directed to amend the implementing zoning bylaw as follows. For the purpose of, 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 I'm going to ask staff to clarify this. For the purpose of the laneway housing section of the zoning bylaw, that the front lot line on a through shall be deemed to be the lot line where the principal entrance to the existing single detached dwelling, semi-detached dwelling, or street townhouse dwelling is provided. If I could ask staff to just help me out on the intent to identify the situation as opposed to just strictly identifying an example street. And so to ensure that we don't end up amending this throughout the months and years ahead for street by street example. Through to you, Chair. If I could ask staff to just clarify that I have the wording on the amendment correct and the intent.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the councillor, just to clarify. So in a situation where a lot fronts onto two streets, that lot is considered to be a through lot. And under the zoning bylaw, a through lot has two front yards. In many of the situations, I think what the councillor is referring to, though, over time, these properties have developed where the homeowners collectively have agreed that one of those two front yards is going to be their de facto backyard. And so what the wording does, and staff will then translate it into more correct language for the purposes of the zoning bylaw, is to say that front yard that functions as the de facto front yard, i.e. where the principal entrance of the dwelling, will be deemed to be the front lot line for the purposes of the zoning bylaw, and by extension, the other quote front yard, which is really the de facto rear yard, will be the location where a laneway house will be permitted, or a detached SDU laneway house will be permitted in accordance with the applicable provisions of the zoning bylaw. Given that there's multiple short little streets throughout the lower city that are through lots for the purposes of the zoning bylaw, rather than trying to go and make sure that we identify all of them, but we may inadvertently miss one, this would just be a direction to staff. So between now and council, we will translate it into proper zoning language to avoid this situation, providing a hardship onto homeowners going forward. So effectively for the streets, as the speaker earlier was talking about, it'll allow them to build a detached secondary dwelling unit, a detached secondary dwelling unit in their quote unquote de facto rear yard, in accordance with the other setback and performance regulations that anybody who on a normal interior lot would be subject to. So it just sort of levels the playing field and doesn't inadvertently penalize somebody who happens to have bought a house on a through lot because of a historic condition or situation. Thank you.
Yeah, what Steve said.
It's good planning.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an additional amendment moved by yourself, seconded by Councillor Farr. Thank you. Does committee need to see that, or are we okay with as described by Director Robichaud? We're good? Yeah. Okay, so we'll call the vote on that additional amendment, unless there's any discussion.
And Mr. Chair, I have another one after this. Thank you.
Okay. All in favor or opposed of that amendment as described? Thank you. That carries 7-1. Then your second amendment, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. So I raised it in my questions about the gross floor area. Councillor Farr did a far better job of breaking it down and trying to get at the rationale in his questions, actually. So I wish to thank him formally. There are, in Ward 1, there are a number of streets that have very long, very large back lots for historical reasons. And as Councillor, my colleague from Ward 2 noted, we did receive a number of some feedback, quite a bit of feedback during the consultation, advocating for, rather than sticking, we went from the 50 square meters to the 75, that rather than maybe doing what was suggested in testing this through the Committee of Adjustment, and yes, we have a lower permitting rate of, I think it was $650. But rather than put that burden, could we not, in fact, recognize that on larger, deeper lots, we have more room, and to provide for a scale which would, an allowance, if you will, that would reflect that. So if you beg your indulgence, I'm just going to get the wording from staff. Thank you. That section 19.1.1 of the proposed amendments to zoning bylaw number 6593 be amended as follows. That subsection 19.1.1 (2) be amended to add the following words underlined such that the subsection reads as follows. And I recognize that this is difficult for committee because it's just me reading it and there's no context. And all floor areas of rooms, halls, corridors, and stairwells beyond the minimum required by law to provide handicap accessibility, that subsection 19.1.1.2.6 be amended to add a new subsection as follows. B, where the lot area is greater than 360 square meters, the maximum gross floor area may be increased by 30 square meters to a maximum gross floor area of 105 square meters. I think that, and I would ask if I could, again, to Mr. Robichaud, to throw me a helpline here and make sure I've put it in the correct context, and also to Councillor Farr, if he would like to speak to it as well.
Director
Through you,
Robichaud.
Mr. Chairman, to the ward councillor. The councillor is correct. So the first set of amendments that are being proposed are just to add clarification to the language in the zoning bylaw that if you are building more than what's required by the building code to accommodate handicap accessibility, you will not be penalized for the purposes of how we measure and calculate gross floor area. So if you make the hallway extra wide, or you make one of the rooms larger in order to make it more to accommodate accessibility, that increase in that GFA sort of gets netted out and you're not being penalized by that. And then the second amendment essentially says on larger lots, you can increase the lots that are bigger than a typical C lot in the city of Hamilton, which is a 40 by 100 foot lot. You can increase the gross floor area by 30 square meters up to 105 square meters. And that is in response to those larger lot situations and the public submissions that we received to date where people were looking to build, you know, a unit roughly at 100 to 101 square meters. And by adding it to 105 square meters, it provides for a bit of flexibility when you do that metric to imperial conversion and buffer room for the applicants. So they're not finding that the metric to imperial conversion causes problems for them. So both of those amendments would be in response to the public submissions and the delegations in the discussion earlier today. Thank you.
Councillor?
Thank you again, Mr. Robichaud, particularly putting it into the context of the public submissions that were received. I appreciate that. So that's for the consideration of committee. I believe it's seconded by Councillor Farr. Thank you, Councillor Farr.
Any discussion on that amendment from committee? Councillor Farr?
No, I'm pretty good with it, and I want to thank the mover and also Steve for making some quick work. It's a good solution, provides some flexibility, and I think as well doesn't for future overextend our already overextended volunteers on the Committee of Adjustment. So thank you. Happy to second.
Thank you. And could I just turn the chair over to Councillor Johnson?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So no problem with you know, the allowance for accessibility, additional space, but 105 square meters is the equivalent of 1,130 square feet. So that's bigger than my house. And we're getting into a situation here where if you're talking about a secondary dwelling unit that's separated from the main house, you know, that's a whole other house on the same property. And, you know, again, once we're starting to talk about an almost a 1,200 square foot secondary unit, you know, like we're getting away from what, in my opinion, is the goal that we're trying to achieve with secondary dwelling units. And again, if you have that much room, you can always go to Committee of Adjustment to apply for that much space if you have a property that truly needs it. But to include it as of right, I'm just going to not support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair's back to you.
Sorry, muted myself. Thank you. So we'll call the question if there's no further discussion on that.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, are we voting on the two amendments on the same vote, or can we separate them? Because I have the same concern that you have.
I'm sorry, I thought that we had already voted. Did we not vote on the first one?
We did. So this is just the second one now that we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's all, yeah, I'm sorry, Councillor Collins, we did already vote on the initial one. That was the through lot issue. And then this one is specific for increasing the size based on the lot size. So actually, I voted incorrectly. Can you reset? My apologies, everyone. Okay, so please vote accordingly. Councillor Partridge, are you in favor or opposed? In favor, thank you. And that is defeated on a tie, 4-4. Thank you. Nice. Is there any other discussion or amendments, secondary suites bylaw, before we go to the final two votes on this? Councillor Johnson.
So I just want to be clear, if this passes today, then the rural folks will be able to add on to their existing homestead, not to develop a second building. I just want to be clear.
Dr. Robichaud?
Mr. Robichaud?
That is, through the chairman, that is correct.
Thank you. I'm ready to vote.
Thank you. So we're going to have two votes here. The first is that the public submissions were received and considered by the committee in approving the city initiatives. And I need a mover and a seconder for that. By Councillor Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Farr. All in favor or opposed? Thank you. That carries unanimously. And then finally, I need a mover and a seconder to approve the report recommendations as amended. Moved by Councillor Farr, seconded by Councillor Partridge. Would you like to second? Yep. Thank you. And Councillor Farr?
Yeah, this is a big deal. I just want to say very quickly that we should be celebrating the fact that interest in this community is burgeoning from our residents to make SDU investments. I've heard from many. When we permitted laneways some years back, I was been a little disappointed that there's only been a few conversations in my ward about that, and now it's much more on the front burner. So staff have excelled in this development of these recommendations and this issue since the 90s, as I think Stephen and Joanne have alluded to in the past. So it's a big moment for them, I'm sure, the Joannes, the Tims, and so many others. But what we have here is an opportunity for parents to age in place, for neighborhoods to thrive, and that includes small businesses and jobs and community safety. We didn't really talk about Jane Jacobs stuff and eyes on the street and those sorts of things. I think a few delegates brought that up, but this is that. It addresses that. Intensification, obviously, with gentle intensification. That definitely was a prevailing theme throughout this two planning committee debate on these amendments. beautification, and of course affordability. I believe the more rental stock we're in need, the more of that supply, the better the opportunity, at least, that rents and demands for higher rents is abated and mitigated. So we have gaps in the current 05-200, probably like every community as it relates to this Bill 108. And we can fill them in here in Hamilton, or we can let the province sort of run with whatever they want to run with going forward by not supporting what's here. 2019 in June, Bill 108 was passed. We're requested by the province to permit SDUs in our official plan, in our zoning, and we've already passed it ourselves. We've approved amendments a few months ago to allow SDUs. Now what we're doing here is putting in some made in Hamilton regulations, and we're adding these regulations and a few more today with the work committee did today, and good work by committee today, in our way, unique to Hamilton, and what our residents and our city staff and we on planning committee and council recognize is best, not what the province dictates. So the devil's in the details, and we've covered with tremendous work again from Joanne and Tim and others, those details. Putting Hamilton standards on a provincially mandated policy. So thank you so much. It is really important, and I'm sure in time we will be able to actually have physical evidence that the moves we're making now are dramatically affecting our communities for the better. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion on the report before we call the vote? Not seeing any. And a really sincere appreciation for all the work that our staff have put into this. I think what's evident over these last two meetings where we've discussed this is how hard it is to initiate one bylaw for our entire city with 200 years worth of growth and all the complexities involved therein. So with that, we will go to the final vote. Moved by Councillor Farr, seconded by Councillor Partridge. All in favor or opposed? I'm the last vote. That carries 7-1. Thank you. Okay, next on our agenda is item 10.2, the dedicated Mohawk College enforcement. Councillor Partridge?
Yeah, sorry, Chair. The vote didn't come up on my e-scribe, so I just wanted to make sure that I got captured in that vote because I did second it.
We'll double check. So we think that the vote was opened and that you were able to vote, and then Councillor Farr spoke, and then the vote stayed open. So
oh, that's why. Yes, with the length of time that was involved between my voting and him speaking and coming back. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right, does that clear up the confusion with everybody else as well? Thank you. Okay. No dead air. Okay, so where were we? 10.2 is the dedicated Mohawk College enforcement, which is deferred from April, and I need a mover and a seconder to approve the recommendations in the report to put this on the floor. Moved by Councillor Farr, seconded by Councillor Ferguson. Is there any discussion on this? Not seeing any. And if I could just hand the chair over again to Councillor Johnson, I'll be really quick.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. And as committee's aware, there is a dedicated parking enforcement officer for Mohawk College. And last year at committee, we made an adjustment that they were no longer just specifically tied to the Mohawk area, that they were able to fill in to other areas around the city. So they were able to cover waterfall enforcement or special events or, other areas that needed parking enforcement. And this report is just basically because of COVID, not a lot of parking enforcement is necessary around the colleges because they've been shut down, more or less. So they've been floating around the city filling in as well. So this is basically just carrying the program forward for another year so that we can assess post-COVID. Thank you. I'll take the chair back. Councillor Johnson, are you able to vote? Thank you. Carries unanimously. Thank you, committee. Much appreciated. Point 3 is no longer on the agenda. 10.4, request for direction to proceed with appeal to the Committee of Adjustment decision to approve a minor variance at HMA blah blah for lands located at 121 and 125 King Street East and Ward 2. So we have a written submission and then the recommendations in the report. So first we're going to receive the written submission. A mover and a seconder. Councillor Farr, seconded by Councillor Partridge. All in favor of receiving submission? Thank you. Got everybody? Thank you. And then to approve the recommendations in the report, who'd like to put this on the table? By Councillor Farr, by Councillor Wilson, and Councillor Farr, you'd like to speak to this? Councillor Farr, you're still on mute.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, the recommendation was to deny, and from this correspondence, I'm fine. There was always commercial contemplated for the front. Along the side was really what that Committee of Adjustment conversation was about. I was supportive of residential along the side, but along the BIA, the King Street commercial corridor, there's no denying that maintains as commercial. So through you to whomever on staff, how might I proceed here in appreciation of the comments you have and your abilities, limited as they may be in this case, yet our ability as a planning committee to just appreciate good faith and then some what's before us in terms of the communication.
So through you, Mr. Chair. So I believe what the council will be looking at in that case is option number 2 is that staff be directed to withdraw the appeal. Certainly the correspondence you have in front of you has been received subsequent to staff filing that placeholder appeal, where the applicant has confirmed that it's not their intention to put residential fronting onto King Street. I can also advise council just verbally that they have taken the necessary steps to revise that variance to actually remove the residential permission from King Street. So that application has been made and it will be proceeding to the Committee of Adjustment in a couple of weeks. So if that is successful, then certainly staff wouldn't have a concern about that King Street frontage because it would remove the residential permission. So if it's council's wish, you could direct us to withdraw the appeal on the basis that the applicant has confirmed that it's not their intention to put residential on King and that they have taken steps to actually remove that residential permission from King. So that would be option 2 in the staff report, if I'm not mistaken, which is the direction to withdraw the appeal.
Page 8 of 9, but I don't know if it alludes to the second part. So it says, council may direct staff to withdraw the appeal letter, which was filed by staff against the decision of the COA to the local planning appeal tribunal, provided that no further appeals are filed. Didn't hear you mention that. Sorry if I missed it, Jason. This option would allow the Committee of Adjustments decision to permit multiple dwelling on the ground floor of the subject property. And again, no reference to commercial forevermore on King. So is that from a previous agenda? Am I reading the wrong option too, Jason?
No, through the chair, you're correct. So if the appeal is withdrawn, then yes, it would I would say temporarily permit the residential at the ground floor of King because they have made a new application that still has to go back to the Committee of Adjustment, which would then remove that residential permission. So, there is the potential the committee would, for some reason, not approve that future variance. But given that the applicant has indicated it's their intention to not have that commercial on at the residential, it was never their intention actually.
No.
In terms of what they have corresponded with us, that would then remove the residential permission again. So for a period of time, yes, it would be in place, but they've made the necessary steps to actually modify that in the future.
Yeah, okay, so with your confident remarks just now in response, I'm happy to move option 2 if I can get a seconder. And this project, by the way, is, thank you, Councillor Ferguson will second it, looking really good. A lot of work has been done to date, and we want to maintain the pace. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion? Councillor Wilson?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the previous speaker. I obviously don't have the depth of knowledge, but I did watch the January, I think it was January 21st Committee of Adjustment discussion on this file, in which it was a 4-4 vote. It got approval with the chair stepping in to break the tie, and the members of the committee who were opposed to it made the case, and I think rightfully so, that it wasn't a minor variance, it was a zoning matter. So just so I understand, sorry to belabor this, through the chair to the general manager, at that January Committee of Adjustment hearing, was the application the application at the time was to enable residential on the King's side and the Catherine side? Through you, Chair.
So through the chair, yes, that is what was in front of Committee of Adjustment, and so that is what they ultimately approved as residential over the entire ground floor area. Mm-hmm. The applicant has made clear that wasn't their intent to put residential on the King Street frontage, and so they have expressed the willingness, and in fact, they've already taken the necessary steps to go back to the Committee of Adjustment to revise that permission to remove residential permission from the King Street frontage. It would only be permitted on the side street frontage.
Thank you. Through you to the chair. That wasn't clear to me from when I listened to the video last night. There were questions about intended size of units, 500 to 900. And if it was the intent to change it into a work-live situation, they mused about putting steps down to the sidewalk, perhaps a loft, so not casting any shade, but just so I understand the process, how do we, if this committee goes ahead with the option not to proceed with an appeal, how do we, and the Committee of Adjustment has not yet heard that new intent just to have it along Catherine, how do we ensure that that is actually filed, if you will, if we've already signaled our intent not to appeal? Through you, Chair.
So through the chair, as I said, they have actually taken the steps to proceed to that variance application. I believe May 20th is when it's scheduled to be heard. So that is in process. To the councillor's question, yes, I suppose there is always a risk that they could, subsequent to council withdrawing the appeal, withdraw the application or not, or change their mind at Committee of Adjustment. But I can tell you from the conversations we've had with the applicant, what they have indicated is that's their intention to have commercial at the King Street frontage, and that was their intention with their Committee of Adjustment application.
Councillor?
Yeah, thank you. It wasn't clear to me that was their intent at the Committee of Adjustment when I watched the tape, but thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So no further discussion, I don't think, on this. So do we need a vote, 2 votes, or just 1 vote as amended? Yeah, okay. So then the action is to approve option 2, which is a staff withdrawal of the appeal, moved by Councillor Farr and seconded by Councillor Ferguson. All in favor? Councillor Ferguson still, yeah. All in favor or opposed? Thank you. That carries unanimously. To motions. We have 11-1, the Ancaster Tennis Club. Councillor Ferguson, would you present your motion?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the 5 tennis courts that are located in Ancaster Square. So the tennis courts are owned by the city. And the tennis club would like to put a dome over those 5 courts just in the winter. And it's been a long process for them to get the necessary approvals, whether it's getting geotechnical information and redesign of the anchor beam. And these are all being done by volunteers. So they went past the deadline of September 26th, and they're just about ready to go now. They got financing pretty much lined up. And so the motion is that staff be directed to waive the City of Hamilton fee for the required site plan application for 291 Lotus Street. And that's because the time lapsed past September 26, 2020.
Thank you,
So I
Councillor.
moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Farr.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion you have before you? Not seeing any, so moved by Councillor Ferguson, second Farr. All in favor or opposed? Thank you. That's unanimous. 11-2, 2004 Glancaster Road, the Braun Nursery, waiving of moratorium for a minor variance application. Deferred.
Yes, this is something that Braun Nursery approached me on, and his consultant Ed Fothergill, and they got approval to build a new barn, and with specific heights and so on. And they've discovered after the design was finished and construction about to commence, so a part of the building is slightly higher than what was shown on the approvals. So they would like to go to committee of adjustment to get a variance on that. They're not asking us to approve that. They're simply asking us to give approval for them to make an application before the committee of adjustment. Apparently, we have a rule in place that you can't apply to committee of adjustment for variances until after 2 years, and they'd like to move forward with this now. It's a seasonal business, and they need to get on with it. So I move that the council provide authorization to Braun Nursery Limited and Fothergill Planning and Development to apply for a minor variance for lands located at 2004 Glancaster Road in order to permit a building height of 11.5 meters and to vary a site-specific bylaw within the last 2 years.
Thank you, Councillor. Seconded by Councillor Partridge. Thank you. Is there any discussion on this? Not seeing any from committee. Okay, all in favor or opposed? Thank you. It carries unanimously. To our information and other business, we have our general manager's update. General Manager Thorne, do you have any updates for committee?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, nothing today.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Farr, other business?
Yes, we concluded a lengthy SDU debate, and I'm not intending to get back into it, but there was a 2-part motion on the amendment that ended in a tie and failed. And I'm wondering if staff or Jason, you may have got the sense that the first part might have been a little more amenable. And if so, I would like to bring it up again, not here, because we're finished with that item, but at council. And that has to do with the part about the accessibility.
Director Robichaud, is that something we can address at council? Or in advance of council?
So through you, Mr. Chair, certainly it's council can also consider any other additional amendments that you may wish. I'd have to defer to clerks as to whether or not an additional amendment could be brought now at Planning Committee, I didn't think so. But certainly at Council, if there's additional amendments, they could be brought forward.
I'm not looking to do it now. So why don't I just do this? I'll put everybody on Planning Committee on notice. I'll send just that piece to everyone, so it doesn't look like I'm trying to catch my committee members off guard when and if I bring this forward. It's essentially bringing back or pulling from the agenda one part of a two-part motion that was defeated in a tie. I'll let committee know. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Councillor Farr. Any other business, Councillor Wilson?
So I must have missed that. Thank you, through you, Chair, to the clerk, because I recall one of my colleagues, I think it was Councillor Collins, asking for that vote to be split because his intent, I believe, at the time was to support the first part and not the gross floor area. Maybe I'm wrong, and if I could just check through with clerks through you, but maybe not.
I'd actually defer to staff because I understood they were interrelated, but maybe I was wrong.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, they are sort of two separate changes to the zoning bylaw were being contemplated. One was to provide clarification around the language where if somebody seeks to increase the size of a hallway to accommodate, for handicap accessibility considerations, they would not get penalized. That was a separate consideration than the changes to the zoning bylaw to allow for a larger SDU if the lot size was larger. So they are two separate zoning bylaw amendments dealing with two separate parts of the zoning bylaw. So there was no reason why they could not have been considered separately, but that would be, again, at the will of committee.
And thank you, through you, Chair, to Mr. Robichaud. Thank you for that. And that's what I thought the intent and call was from one of my colleagues at the time. So a little.
They were voted on together, and Councillor Collins, if I recall, his question was about the previous vote.
I beg your pardon.
Councillor Collins, did you wish to?
No, I was addressing the accessibility issue, which I thought was distinct from the size of the structure, and that's why I asked that they be separated.
Thank you.
The answer to my question was that it was already approved, and so I moved on with that answer.
Mm-hmm.
My apologies then. Councillor Partridge?
Yes, thank you. I also thought they were two separate votes. I very clearly, I thought we voted on Councillor Wilson's accessibility one first, and then it was after that Councillor Collins asked his question. So not sure how we resolve it, but that was my recollection as well.
Let me just speak to clerks, and I believe if we're still in the meeting, we could revise our vote. So let me just confer for 1 second here. Okay, so what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to do a in-meeting reconsideration of that vote, then split it to the accessibility amendment, separate from the increase to the building size relative to the lot size. So we'll split that into two separate votes. So there'll be a reconsideration, then the vote on the accessibility, and then the vote on the increase in size relative to lot size.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just a process question.
Mm-hmm.
If this is a reconsideration for your motion, do you turn the chair over?
It was Councillor Wilson's motion.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. What's this mean? Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so mover and seconder for reconsideration. In meeting reconsideration. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Wilson. I think this is the first time I've done it in meeting reconsideration, but cleans it up having to do it at council next week. Thank you. That carries 7-1. And then on the amendment, or maybe Director Robichaud, could you just summarize what the accessibility amendment was? Or Councillor Wilson, this is your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of the motion dealing with accessibility is to amend the definition of gross floor area, or how the gross floor area is calculated, to explicitly state that any areas that exceed the minimum requirement, with any areas, i.e. rooms, hallways, or other stairwells, et cetera, where they exceed the minimum requirements of the OBC in order to meet accessibility requirements, that excessive area, for lack of better terms, is excluded from the definition of gross floor area, so that the property owner is not being penalized for making sure that the units meet or exceed accessibility standards in terms of the design and construction of their secondary dwelling units. Thank you.
Thank you. So are we clear on that? Anybody, any clarification? Clear, Elsie Kelsey? The accessibility one, yes. So moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Farr, I think it was. So all in favor or opposed? Thank you. That carries unanimously. And then on the second half of that, again, I'll go back to the original mover, Councillor Wilson or Director Robichaud, to just clarify what this one was.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the effect of the second, or the proposed amendment, is to say that in those situations where lots are greater than 360 square meters, that the gross floor area of the dwelling, of this detached secondary dwelling unit, can be increased by a maximum of 30 square meters to a total of 105 square meters. The 360 square meters is considered to be a typical lot within the city of Hamilton, within either a C or a D zone district or in other parts of the city, that being approximately a 40 by 100 square foot lot, or which works out to 4,000 square feet, and that's approximately 360 square meters. So in those situations where an individual has a very large lot, they would be allowed to build a larger detached secondary dwelling unit than would be normally permitted under the regulations initially proposed by staff of 75 square meters. And the cap is at 105 square meters based on the public feedback and some of the submissions we had received, where some of the proponents were seeking to increase the GFA to 100 square meters. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the committee need any further clarification? Not seeing any. So again, that was moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Farr. All in favor? Councillor Collins?
No, I was just going to say this is the one that lost on a tie, correct?
Correct. So all in favor or opposed? And that is defeated 3-5. Thank you. Okay, I think we did all of that up. Do we need a final vote on the report as amended, or it still stands as amended? We're good? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So we are procedurally in order. Thank you. So I don't have anything else in my agenda here. So adjournment. Who'd like to move in second? Moved by Councillor Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor?
Excellent job, Mr. Chairman, and to staff. Thank you so much.
Well done, everybody. Thank you.